Big Shaq was minding his own business when a hotel heiress smirked. "You don't belong here." The lobby went silent. Guests whispered, cameras rolled. But instead of arguing, Shaq just smiled. Because he had a plan. What he did next humiliated her, flipped the entire resort upside down, and taught everyone a lesson they'd never forget. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The Bellagio Azul Resort was a kingdom for the ultra-rich, where the elite came to escape, hidden behind a fortress of exclusivity. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, the scent of expensive perfume mingling with the faint aroma of imported cigars. Everything about this place whispered, "You don't belong here unless you were born into it." Shaquille O'Neal, standing at the front desk in a relaxed designer tracksuit, didn't seem to care. He had been in luxury hotels all over the world. This was just another spot to unwind. But to Vivian Lockwood, the heiress of the Bellagio Azul Empire, Shaq wasn't just another guest. He was a problem. From across the lobby, she spotted him. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute as she studied him with a disapproving sneer. Another celebrity thinking money can buy his way into anywhere. She was tired of seeing his kind disrupt the exclusivity of her resort. With slow, deliberate steps, she glided toward the front desk, her silk dress flowing behind her. The receptionist, who had been smiling while checking Shaq in, stiffened at her approach. "Excuse me," Vivian said sweetly, though her expression remained ice cold. "Can I help you?" Shaq barely glanced at her. "Nah, I'm good," he replied smoothly, sliding his black VIP card across the desk. "Just checking in." Vivian's lips curled into a fake smile. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary." Shaq finally looked at her, one eyebrow raised. "That's so?" Vivian plucked the reservation printout from the receptionist's hand, holding it up as if it were a mistake. "We have a very selective guest list here," she said, each word dripping with condescension. "And you, well, you don't quite fit the profile." The lobby fell silent. Staff members exchanged nervous glances. A few guests, intrigued by the scene, sipped their cocktails while watching the drama unfold. Shaq exhaled through his nose, amused. "That right?" Without hesitation, Vivian ripped the reservation in half. Gas rippled through the lobby. The torn paper fluttered to the desk like fallen leaves, the moment stretching into a tense silence. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head as he adjusted his sunglasses. Then, with the same calm authority that made him a legend, he leaned forward slightly and said, "You sure you want to do this?" Vivian smirked, crossing her arms. "I'm positive." She had no idea what she had just started. The storm was coming, and Vivian Lockwood had just made the worst mistake of her life. A smug smile curled on Vivian Lockwood's lips as she let the torn reservation slip from her fingers. The tiny pieces landed on the front desk, a silent declaration that she was in control. Shaq didn't flinch. He stood there towering over her, completely unfazed. The way his eyes locked onto hers made her uncomfortable, like he was analyzing her, deciding if she was even worth his time. But Vivian wasn't about to back down. If anything, the growing tension only fueled her ego. She turned to the stunned receptionist. "Kindly remove this man from the premises," she said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some guests exchanged nervous glances. Others, the ones who thrived on scandal, leaned in, eager to witness the unfolding drama. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne hesitated mid-step. A bellhop near the luggage cart shifted uncomfortably. Even the security guard stationed near the entrance looked unsure. The receptionist swallowed hard. "Miss Lockwood, Mr. O'Neal is on the VIP list." "Not anymore," Vivian cut in sharply. "I don't care what's in the system. He's not welcome here." Shaq remained calm, his broad shoulders relaxed, his hands in his pockets. But there was something different about his stance now. His easygoing energy had been replaced by something else. Something far more dangerous. Vivian could feel it. Still, she pressed on, determined to drive her point home. She turned to the nearby guests, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, we have a certain standard at the Bellagio Azul," she announced. "Not just anyone can walk in and expect to stay here. This resort is for elite clientele, people of a certain caliber." The words dripped with entitlement. She knew exactly what she was implying. Shaq's jaw tensed. He exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. A nervous waiter, trying to defuse the situation, cleared his throat. Sir, I'm really sorry. We just have strict policies about. Shaq turned to him, offering a small, reassuring nod. Ain't your fault, kid. Vivian scoffed. Oh, please. Don't act like you're the victim here. Shaq finally spoke, his voice low and measured. I don't act like anything. I let the truth speak for itself. Vivian laughed. Well, the truth is, you're not welcome. So why don't you take that oversized ego of yours and leave? A beat of silence. Then Shaq smiled. But it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile that said, you have no idea what you've just done. I'm happy to take my business elsewhere, he said coolly, turning toward the door. Vivian smirked, watching him walk away, convinced she had won. What she doesn't realize is that cameras were rolling, and Shaq never walks away from a challenge. Vivian Lockwood slept soundly that night, convinced she had shut down an unwanted guest and protected her precious resort's exclusivity. By morning, the world had other plans. At exactly 7:02 a.m., her phone buzzed. Then again, and again. A groggy groan escaped her lips as she fumbled for the device, barely cracking open an eye. Who even texts this early? But then, she saw it. Over 100 missed notifications. Her social media accounts flooded with comments, mentions, and direct messages, some from friends, others from strangers. And at the top of her screen, a trending hashtag, boycott Bellagio Azul. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she sat up, fingers shaking while she scrolled through the chaos. Someone had recorded everything, the entire confrontation, the sneer in her voice, the way she ripped up Shaq's reservation, the smug look on her face as she humiliated him in front of the crowd. And the internet was not on her side. The video, uploaded late last night by an anonymous guest, had already racked up 3.2 million views on Twitter alone. It was everywhere. Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. News sites were running with it, headlines screaming in bold capital letters. Rich heiress tries to humiliate Shaquille O'Neal and fails miserably. Bellagio Azul exposed. Entitled owner's daughter sparks outrage. And the worst one? Shaq didn't even have to clap back. The world did it for him. Vivian's face drained of color. She scrolled through the comments, pulse hammering. Wow, this is disgusting. Imagine turning away a literal legend. Shaq is richer than her entire family combined, and she thought she could embarrass him? Mayo. Money can buy a resort, but it sure can't buy class. It wasn't just random internet users piling on. Celebrities were weighing in. NBA stars, movie actors, top influencers. Everyone had something to say. Even billionaires, the kind of people Bellagio Azul actually catered to, were publicly condemning her behavior. Then came the worst part. Investors. A Wall Street journalist had just tweeted, hearing from sources that Bellagio Azul's major investors are getting antsy after the viral video. Public image matters in luxury hospitality. Stay tuned. Vivian's fingers tightened around her phone. Number no, this isn't happening. A soft ding made her glance up. An email from her father. Subject line, what the hell did you do? Vivian laughs it off until her father, the resort owner, calls in absolute rage. The atmosphere inside Richard Lockwood's penthouse office was suffocating. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a breathtaking ocean view, but Richard wasn't admiring the scenery. His hands were clenched into fists as he stared at the tablet in front of him. The video had over 10 million views. Every major news outlet was covering it. And his resort, the empire he built with his own two hands, was at the center of a PR disaster. His phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from investors, board members, and furious guests demanding refunds. The trending hashtag boycott Bellagio Azul refused to die down. And at the center of it all, his own daughter. Richard exhaled sharply, pressing a button on his desk. Get Vivian in here. Now. Moments later, Vivian stormed into the office, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Dad, I already know what this is about, she huffed. It's ridiculous. People are blowing this way out of proportion. Richard turned the tablet toward her, his glare sharp as a blade. Does this look like a joke to you? His voice was low, controlled, but seething with fury. Vivian barely spared the screen a glance. Some nobody filmed me rejecting a guy who didn't belong here. I don't see the big deal. The big deal, Richard growled, standing to his full height, is that the man you humiliated in front of our guests is Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most beloved public figures in the world, a man whose business connections make ours look like child's play. You embarrassed a VIP guest, and you did it on camera. Vivian scoffed, rolling her eyes. So what? He was dressed like some commoner. How was I supposed to know he was important? Richard slammed his fist onto the desk, making her flinch. Because you should treat every guest with respect, not just the ones you think are important. His voice echoed through the room. And now, thanks to you, our stocks are plummeting, sponsors are backing out, and the board is questioning whether you have any place in this company at all. For the first time, real panic flickered across Vivian's face. Wait, what? Richard leaned forward, his expression ice cold. Fix this, Vivian, publicly. Apologize to Shaq. Do whatever it takes to clean up this mess, or you can forget about inheriting this resort. Vivian's mouth opened, but no words came out. You're giving me an ultimatum, she finally whispered. No, Vivian, Richard said grimly. You gave yourself one the moment you decided to act like a spoiled brat in my resort. Vivian's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Fine, she muttered. I'll handle it. She spun on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. But as she pulled out her phone, preparing to draft a carefully worded apology, she hesitated. Would an apology even be enough? Could she actually fix this? She glanced at the news headlines scrolling across her screen. The backlash was relentless. She had no choice. She had to swallow her pride and reach out to Shaq. However, what she didn't know was that Shaq wasn't waiting for an apology. At that very moment, in a sleek, glass-walled office across town, Shaq leaned back in his chair, listening to his lawyer. Investors are panicking, the lawyer said, sliding over a thick file of reports. If you want in, now's the time. Shaq picked up a pen, tapping it against the desk. Then with a slow, knowing smile, he said, Let's make an offer they can't refuse. Instead of waiting for an apology, Shaq calls his lawyer and makes an offer no one saw coming. The boardroom at Bellagio Azul's corporate office was in chaos. Phones buzzed nonstop, investors whispered in worried clusters, and financial analysts scrambled through reports filled with red ink. The resort's stock had taken a nosedive overnight. At the head of the long mahogany table, the chairman, a silver-haired man named Gerald Hawthorne, rubbed his temples. This is a disaster, he muttered. At this rate, we'll have to start liquidating assets. Then the door swung open. A junior analyst rushed in, breathless. Sir, he said, we just received an offer. Hawthorne narrowed his eyes. An offer? From who? The analyst hesitated, almost as if he himself couldn't believe it. Shaquille O'Neal. Silence fell over the room. The investors exchanged wary glances. Hawthorne leaned forward. You're telling me Shaq, the Shaquille O'Neal, wants to buy into Bellagio Azul? Now? The analyst nodded. He's offering to buy shares directly from any investor looking to sell. Given the current drop in value, many are already considering cutting their losses. Hawthorne sat back, stunned. Shaq wasn't just some angry customer trying to make a statement. He saw an opportunity, and he was moving fast. Meanwhile, across town, Shaq sat in a high-rise office, his massive frame dwarfed only by the view behind him. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Leonard Price, placed a stack of documents on the table. We've already had responses from several shareholders, Leonard said, flipping through the pages. They're panicked, and when panic sets in, people are willing to sell for cheap. Shaq nodded, his expression unreadable. And Lockwood? Still holding on to his shares, Leonard replied. But if we hit 51%, it won't matter. You'll have control. Shaq cracked a smile. Then let's make it happen. By midnight, the damage to Bellagio Azul was irreversible. The controversy had made headlines on every major network, and the resort's brand was officially toxic. Major investors, desperate to minimize their losses, began offloading shares. One by one, they sold, until Shaq held the majority stake. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Richard Lockwood arrived at his office to find his board members waiting for him. The mood was grim. "What's this?" he asked, sensing the tension in the air. Gerald Hawthorne cleared his throat, pushing a document across the table. "Richard," he said slowly, "there's been a shift in ownership." Richard frowned, flipping through the paperwork. His face paled. Shaquille O'Neal now owned 51% of Bellagio Azul. By morning, Shaq legally owns 51% of the resort. Vivian Lockwood awoke in her penthouse suite, stretching lazily as the morning sun poured through the sheer white curtains. Last night had been chaotic, with the social media backlash still buzzing in the background. But in her mind, it was just another scandal that would blow over. She reached for her phone, expecting to see a few messages from her PR team about damage control. Instead, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Breaking news. Shaquille O'Neal buys controlling stake in Bellagio Azul. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the article. In a shocking turn of events, NBA legend and business mogul Shaquille O'Neal has acquired a 51% controlling stake in the prestigious Bellagio Azul resort. Sources confirm that major investors, concerned over the public backlash following a viral altercation, were quick to sell their shares. With this purchase, O'Neal now holds the power to dictate the resort's future operations, ousting previous ownership if he chooses. Vivian's breath hitched. This had to be some kind of joke, some ridiculous PR stunt. She threw off the silk covers and bolted out of bed, slipping into a designer robe as she stormed down the hall toward her father's office. When she pushed the double doors open, Richard Lockwood was already seated behind his massive oak desk, staring at his own phone, his expression carved from stone. His advisors stood silently around him, none of them daring to make eye contact with Vivian. "Dad!" she gasped, slamming her phone down on his desk. "Tell me this is fake." Richard exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. His usually immaculate silver hair looked slightly disheveled. "It's not fake," he muttered, rubbing his temples. Vivian's face twisted in disbelief. "What do you mean it's not fake? We own this resort. You're the CEO." Richard looked up slowly, his gaze cold and tired. "Not anymore." Silence. Vivian staggered back a step, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible. You're not saying—" Richard straightened his tie, schooling his expression into something more controlled, but there was an undeniable edge of frustration beneath it. "Congratulations, sweetheart," he said dryly. "You just got yourself a new boss." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. "You sold to him," she whispered. "I didn't sell a damn thing," Richard snapped, slamming a hand on his desk. "Your little stunt tanked our stock. Our investors panicked. Shaq didn't even have to buy us out. Our own people handed him control on a silver platter." Vivian stumbled backward, gripping the chair for support. This couldn't be happening. Before she could form another sentence, a sharp knock on the office door made everyone turn. The doors opened, and the head of security stepped in. His voice was even, but there was something ominous beneath it. "He's here!" Vivian's stomach twisted into knots. Shaq arrives at the resort as the new owner. The moment Shaq stepped through the grand entrance of Bellagio Azul, the entire atmosphere shifted. For years, the resort had been a playground for the elite, a place where wealth dictated worth. But now the dynamic had changed. The real power had just walked in. The staff, who had been forced to tolerate Vivian's arrogance for years, erupted into quiet murmurs before breaking into scattered applause. Some were cautious, not sure if this was real. Others smiled outright, exchanging knowing glances. Shaq, towering and confident, moved through the space with effortless authority. Dressed in a sleek, custom-tailored suit, he exuded the kind of presence that couldn't be ignored. He belonged here, and now this place belonged to him. Vivian, standing near the concierge desk, forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. Her heart pounded in her chest. The last 24 hours had been a whirlwind of chaos, but this was her worst nightmare unfolding in real time. Still, she refused to cower. She crossed her arms, lifting her chin. "So what now?" she asked, feigning disinterest. "You gonna tear the place down?" Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah," he said smoothly. "I like this place. Just needs better management." Vivian's jaw clenched. "You can't just replace me." "Oh, I'm not replacing you," Shaq said. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. "I'm demoting you." Silence fell. Vivian blinked. Excuse me. Shaq turned to the resort's general manager, a middle-aged man who had spent years biting his tongue under Vivian's rule. Make sure she gets properly trained, Shaq instructed. The GM raised an eyebrow. Trained for what, sir? Shaq smiled, then turned back to Vivian. Congratulations, he said. You're the newest front desk employee. A gasp rippled through the staff. A few stifled laughter. Vivian's face burned with humiliation. You can't do this, she sputtered. I own this place. No, Shaq corrected. I own this place. You work for me now. Vivian looked around searching for someone, anyone to intervene. But her father wasn't here to back her up. The investors had already sided with Shaq. And the staff? They looked thrilled. Welcome to customer service, sweetheart, Shaq added with a smirk. Hope you like smiling. Vivian stands frozen as Shaq walks away. The front desk manager steps up and hands her a uniform. Vivian stood behind the front desk, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she shifted uncomfortably. She had spent her life walking through this resort like she owned it. Because she did. Or at least she used to. Now she was standing behind the counter, wearing a stiff navy blue blazer with a plastic name tag pinned to her chest. Vivian, Guest Services. The irony was unbearable. The first customer approached, a middle-aged woman with an air of entitlement, the same kind of demeanor Vivian herself used to have. I need extra towels in my suite, the woman snapped, barely looking at her. Vivian's jaw tightened. Housekeeping handles that. The woman raised an eyebrow. So call them. Vivian inhaled sharply and forced herself to press the button on her headset. This is Vivian, she muttered, the words nearly choking her. Can we send towels to Suite 403? The woman smirked. See? That wasn't so hard. Vivian's nails dug into her palm, but she said nothing. It only got worse. Guests sneered as they recognized her. The viral video was still fresh in their minds. So, a man chuckled as she checked him in. You went from heiress to front desk clerk? Talk about karma. His wife nudged him, but even she was holding back a grin. Vivian's face burned with shame. She had humiliated people for less. Now the universe was paying her back tenfold. Then came the moment she truly hit rock bottom. A child spilled orange juice across the pristine lobby floor, and before she could react, the front desk manager handed her a mop. You're on cleanup duty, he said, barely masking his amusement. Vivian gawked at him. What? You heard me. For the first time in her life, Vivian had to clean up after someone else. Her fingers gripped the mop handle, her stomach twisting as she crouched to soak up the sticky mess. Tourists walked past, whispering. Some even took photos. She squeezed her eyes shut. It's just one moment. It'll pass. It doesn't mean anything. Then the concierge's voice broke through her humiliation. Miss Lockwood, he called from the front desk, struggling to keep a straight face. We have a very important guest checking in. Vivian, still kneeling on the floor, turned to see who it was. Her stomach dropped. Walking toward her, suitcase in hand, was the last person she ever wanted to see, her father's most powerful business rival. Vivian's hands trembled as she adjusted the folded napkins on the table. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. The exclusive Bellagio Azul's private dining hall was reserved for only the most powerful guests, the kind of men her father had built his empire alongside. For years, she had sat at these very tables, sipping on imported wine, flashing a condescending smile at business moguls, pretending she was their equal. But tonight, she wasn't a guest. She was their waitress. The moment Richard Lockwood's business partners entered the dining hall, the humiliation deepened. These weren't just investors. They were men who had known Vivian since childhood. She had attended their yacht parties, spent summers at their vacation homes, worn designer gowns to their extravagant galas. And now she had to serve them dinner. The air in the room shifted as they settled in. Men in tailored suits took their seats, their expensive watches glinting under the chandeliers. At the head of the table sat Shaq. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply sat there, larger than life, speaking casually with the other men, as if he had belonged in this world all along. Vivian swallowed hard, gripping the tray of drinks tighter. Miss Lockwood, the maitre d' whispered. You're up. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, forcing herself to smile. Gentlemen, welcome, she said, her voice rehearsed but fragile. May I offer you a drink? No one responded. The men barely looked at her. They used to treat me like a queen, she thought bitterly. Now I'm invisible. Then one voice cut through the silence. I'll take a whiskey, a deep voice rumbled. Vivian turned and felt her stomach lurch. It was Nathan Holloway, a billionaire philanthropist, one of her father's most powerful allies, and a longtime supporter of Shaq. As she poured his drink, Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying Shaq with interest. You know, I've been keeping an eye on what you've done with this place. Shaq took a sip of his own drink, nodding. Hope I haven't disappointed. Quite the opposite, Nathan chuckled. This resort was a playground for the elite. But you turned it into something bigger, more meaningful. That takes real leadership. Vivian froze. Her father had spent decades trying to earn Holloway's respect. And now in just a few weeks, Shaq had it effortlessly. Vivian's hands curled into fists. She had spent her whole life believing she was the future of Bellagio Azul, that she was destined to inherit her father's empire. But tonight, she realized the truth. She had never been respected, never been qualified. The executives never took her seriously. And Shaq? He had done what she never could, earned their trust. The final blow came when Richard Lockwood himself stepped into the room. The conversation halted as all eyes turned to him. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders was impossible to miss. For a long moment, he simply stared at Shaq. Then, he turned to Vivian. Stand up, he ordered. Vivian did. Slowly. A pause. Then in front of everyone, her father bowed his head toward Shaq. I apologize, and Richard said. His voice was rough, but the words were unmistakable. For my daughter's behavior, and for failing to see what this place truly needed. Vivian felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. Her father, the man who once believed she was his greatest legacy, was admitting out loud that he had backed the wrong horse. But he wasn't finished. Richard turned back to her, his expression ice cold. You are no longer my successor, he said flatly. As of this moment, you are cut off from everything. Vivian's heart stopped. She had seen her father angry before. But this was final. As the words sank in, Vivian felt the ground beneath her shift. She was no longer the heiress of Bellagio Azul. She was nothing. Vivian sat frozen in her father's office, her breath shallow. This isn't happening. This isn't real. The words kept looping in her mind, but no matter how many times she tried to push them away, the truth remained. Richard Lockwood had cut her off. No money, no inheritance, no stake in Bellagio Azul. She wasn't just losing her status. She was losing everything. Dad, please, she whispered, barely able to speak. You don't mean this. Richard's expression didn't change. You brought this on yourself. The room was silent. The powerful men who once laughed at her jokes now averted their gazes. Nathan Holloway swirled the whiskey in his glass, unimpressed. Shaq remained seated, arms crossed, watching. Vivian turned to him, desperation creeping into her voice. Shaq, tell him this is too far. Shaq didn't flinch. I didn't do this, Vivian. You did. Her stomach twisted. She had spent her whole life believing that her name alone made her untouchable, that no matter how she behaved, money and power would protect her. But now, she had neither. The realization shattered her pride like glass hitting concrete. Security escorted her out of the office. Past resort staff, who once bowed at her every demand. Now they barely acknowledged her. Her walk of shame ended at the private suite she once called home. She stumbled inside and slammed the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her designer luggage sat neatly in the corner, waiting for her to pack up her old life. Vivian's hands shook as she pulled open the drawers, stuffing clothes, shoes, and jewelry into her bags. But with every item she touched, the memories flooded in. The luxury, the privilege, the power, gone. The weight of it all crushed her chest. Where will I even go? She had never worked a real job, never paid a bill, never even booked her own flights. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. Then she saw it, a plain white envelope sitting on the bed. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up. Scrawled on the front in bold letters was just one word: opportunity. Vivian's heart pounded as she ripped open the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was something she never expected. Vivian's fingers trembled as she tore open the envelope. Inside, there was no check, no apology, no last-minute offer to restore her wealth. Just a single piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly, her breath hitching as she read the words at the top. Employment offer. The O'Neill Foundation. Her heart pounded. It wasn't a lifeline. It was a test. She skimmed the details. A full-time position at Shaq's charity organization, focusing on community outreach, working directly with underprivileged youth. A real job. A modest salary. No luxury perks. No easy way out. Her throat went dry. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered. Her hands clenched the paper as she sat on the edge of the bed. This had to be a joke. For the first time in her life, she would have to work. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She imagined herself trading designer heels for sneakers, power lunches for food drives, VIP lounges for community centers. It was humiliating. But then, a darker thought crept in. What other choice did she have? Her father had cut her off completely. Her credit cards were frozen. The house, the cars, the staff, all gone. She had burned every bridge. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut. She could refuse. She could walk away, cling to her pride, pretend none of this was happening. But where would she go? A sharp knock on the door shattered her thoughts. She jolted, turning to see Shaq leaning against the doorway. "You read it?" he asked, his voice calm. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You think I need your pity?" she snapped. Shaq shook his head. "I don't do pity." He stepped inside, his towering frame making the room feel smaller. "You wanted to be a boss, right?" he said. "You wanted power, control, respect?" Vivian stayed silent. "Then earn it," he said simply. Her nails dug into the paper. "I don't belong in some charity job," she spat. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, 'cause last time I checked, you don't belong anywhere right now." His words hit like a slap. Vivian's breathing grew uneven. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. "Look, Vivian, you can sit here feeling sorry for yourself, or you can get up, start over, and prove to yourself and everyone else that you're more than your last name." Her chest tightened. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to lash out, to hold on to what little pride she had left. But her heart whispered something different. She stared down at the paper in her hands, her fingers trembling. Vivian closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and signed her name. The Bellagio Azul had undergone a transformation unlike anything the industry had seen before. Once a resort known for its exclusivity and rigid policies, it now stood as a beacon of change, welcoming people from all backgrounds, fostering inclusivity, and making a real impact beyond luxury. The grandeur of the lobby remained. The shimmering chandeliers still hung from the ceilings, and the marble floors still gleamed beneath the golden lights. But the heart of the resort had changed. It was no longer just a playground for the ultra-wealthy. It had become something more. Under Shaq's leadership, Bellagio Azul was no longer defined by its ability to keep people out, but by its efforts to bring people in. A new initiative had been introduced where a portion of the resort's revenue was directed toward charitable causes, including funding local schools, community centers, and providing scholarships to underprivileged students. Events that once catered only to the elite now welcomed a more diverse crowd, and an annual charity gala had been established, raising millions for those in need. Employees no longer feared losing their jobs over minor infractions. Instead, they were valued, trained, and given opportunities to grow. The energy in the resort had shifted. There was warmth now, real, tangible warmth that had never existed before. And in the middle of it all, Vivian Lockwood had found her place, not as the entitled heiress who once ruled with arrogance, but as someone who had finally learned the value of humility and hard work. She no longer carried herself with the cold superiority that once defined her presence at Bellagio Azul. Instead, she moved with quiet confidence, assisting guests with a genuine smile, ensuring they felt welcome in a way she had once failed to. Gone were the designer gowns and the condescending glares. Now she wore a modest yet professional uniform, working behind the concierge desk, one of the very places she had dismissed as beneath her. As she finished assisting a family with their reservations, a guest hesitated before approaching her. A woman in her mid-40s, well-dressed but kind-eyed, studied Vivian for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me," she said, tilting her head slightly, as if piecing together a distant memory. Weren't you the owner's daughter? For a brief second, Vivian considered her answer. The old her would have cringed at the question, desperate to remind the world of her former status. But now she simply smiled. A real, genuine smile, not the forced, rehearsed one she had perfected in her previous life. I was, she admitted, her voice steady, but I work for someone much better now. From across the lobby, Shaq watched the interaction unfold. He leaned casually against one of the resort's grand pillars, his towering presence going unnoticed by most, but his eyes observant. He saw the way Vivian carried herself, the way she spoke with sincerity, the way she had truly learned from everything that had happened. He had given her the opportunity to change, but she had done the rest. A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to remind her of the journey she had taken. The lesson had been learned. The legacy of change had begun. As Shaq turned to leave, Vivian caught sight of him from across the room. Their eyes met briefly. No words were spoken, yet there was understanding between them. She gave him a small, grateful nod. Shaq, ever the man of few words, simply nodded back before walking away. The story that had begun with arrogance and exclusion had ended with redemption and purpose. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered.